All right, guys, today we are talking about focal point and emphasis. And they really do go together in how they work to create a direction for which the viewer is looking at the artwork, right? So we're going to dive into the specifics of focal point in just a minute, but we're going to talk about emphasis and when you can have the lack of emphasis as well. So just to define focal point, then, right? It's a specific tool essentially that artists use in order to direct the viewer to a specific point, right? This is the artist wants the viewer to look at something as the main point of the artwork. Usually that specific point is important, right? It usually contains the meaning or value of the artwork. So when you have when you're looking at an artwork and you figure out what the focal point is, one of the things you want to assess is, okay, why did the artist direct me to view this, right? Why is this the focal point, right? That's kind of always the question that you want to ask, because once you can determine why that's the focal point, first, what is the focal point? And then why is it the focal point? Usually, then you can assess, right, the meaning that the artist was wanting to provide. And so the other thing with that, right, is just the focal point is the place in an area to emphasize what the artist is trying to draw our eye to. Okay, so then that gets to emphasis and how it's used. And there's a couple of things with emphasis that can be the opposite of that usually. So we'll put usually. Emphasis is used to draw the viewer to the focal point. Okay, where you create specific emphasis that attracts. However, emphasis can sometimes be used to where the goal is to provide emphasis of the whole artwork. And we'll look at a couple examples here. Or you can have no emphasis. Right? And I mean, in that sense, the emphasis is the whole artwork. But there's two kind of different styles of no emphasis and emphasis of the whole. And so you have where artists will intentionally create a composition that doesn't have a dominant area of emphasis. So the one with the emphasis of the whole artwork, there's no dominant area. No emphasis technically would fit under that as well. But again, we'll look at the images in just a minute. You see there's some where there's no distinct emphasis in the entire artwork. Really, they compared to one where there's emphasis, but it's of the whole artwork in of itself. They're very similar. And you know, if you just said, well, the emphasis is the whole artwork versus no emphasis, that would be usually okay. I'm just going to nitpick on the slight differences that you can see with this. So with the emphasis to encompass the whole artwork, right? The artist can also do where you have use emphasis to essentially cover a large part of the artwork. So that it takes up, it looks like it's, you know, it's the whole, but it's not quite the whole thing. So the emphasis to cover a large part of the artwork for a significant area. right? But not the whole thing. These usually see where this is the idea that the majority of the artwork is the emphasis, and there's just a small area where that's not the case. The other thing that can be used with emphasis is that it can broadly cover a large area or a large section. When there's multiple elements, within the work. So we'll look at that example, but no one element dominates. Usually, you're going to see emphasis of the whole artwork is going to be kind of be connected to that one. So let's look at some examples of that. Okay, so here's one when what I would say you don't have emphasis. This is where, again, you could say, well, it's the whole, but the whole thing is that work. There's no focal point. There's no specific area of emphasis to guide your eye, right? So what's the point of this? And I'll add that to the notes in a minute as well. Well, one, it depends on what the content is. In this case, right, we have the ocean. You get a sense of vast and large, unending, because there is no one place to look at, and so it creates this idea that it's just this endless thing. The ocean is this endless thing. That's how a lack of emphasis can be used. Here's another one with that. Now, this one you could argue perhaps has multiple elements within it because of the differences in the paint and the drops, and yet there is no kind of emphasis on an idea that covers the whole. So we'll look at the difference. The next two are going to be the different style of emphasis. These two, I'd say, are you don't have a single emphasis. It's too similar. You certainly don't have a focal point, right? Instead, you have to take in the entire artwork. But you don't have different elements, and definitely for this one, not at all. This one, again, some could argue, well, because the paint is different in different areas, that it creates slightly different elements, but it's not easily recognizable. If we go to this one, this is the emphasis over the whole artwork. It's a quilt, yet there's multiple elements within the work, but no one element dominates, right? So all these different squares are different, right? Unlike these may slightly be different, but to the eye when you're looking at it, it doesn't look different. The ocean one, sure, some of the ripples might be different, but it doesn't look different, which is why I'd say that's kind of no emphasis. Where this is emphasis, but it's emphasis of the whole. So you have to take in the whole quilt, and you can clearly see there's individual elements, but none are there because they're all the same size, right? That even though they're different, the size essentially, and because, well, they have similar coloring, these two things then lead to, so here we'll say same or similar size and coloring leads to nothing standing out. And so this forces the emphasis right on the whole. Yet it doesn't have the no emphasis like the other, because you can clearly see your eye. This draws your eye to more specific areas where you start looking at each individual thing. But one of the things that you can tell if you were like, how do I know if something has full emphasis, is when you look at it, do you immediately start looking all around, right? What focal points we'll see are going to draw us in. and you're going to get drawn to a specific point. But when it's just something that focuses on emphasis as a whole, or no emphasis, right, you don't know where to look, and then you just start looking at everything. So one of the other things that this does, let me go back to here, right? If we look at purpose, right? What's the purpose of doing this? Is that it forces you to look at the whole artwork, because it doesn't draw your eye to one single place, right? It can create its own meaning in of itself. Think usually, so one is definitely this vast or large concept. Unending is another, and these often go together. The other can be this idea of continuation, which it could be unending as well. But this idea that there's a continuation of a pattern. Patterns tend to be part of this. Actually, let's put that connected to these. You see, continuation tends to be when there are patterns and structures with it. It also is meant to sometimes suggest that no one thing is important. Or this idea of uniformity, right? So there is a purpose for doing this type of emphasis. And you want to keep that in mind, right? First is just looking around and trying to take in the whole of the artwork, but then asking the question, why was no focal point given? Why was there no directional emphasis to guide you to a location, right? There is a purpose behind that. And then the last emphasis, again, that showcases where you have individual elements, but there's no one thing that it draws your attention. So you have all these people and you can see that they're different, but because they are standing in similar positions and are they don't have faces, right? Everything's general. You don't have a concrete focal point. This one has more of one, in the sense of you could argue that this person here draws the attention some. So this would be on the edge of the broad emphasis, but it's certainly, for the most part, right, it forces you still to look at the whole, because this doesn't immediately draw your attention because it has a similar colors and tones to it, because everyone has a similar, general vague face and colors. You have to kind of look at it more, and then once you've looked at it, you might come around to this, and then your eye might draw to that. But even once you're aware of that, you don't always look to that person anyway. So even though you have this one person out of place from the other, it still creates a more broad emphasis than a focus on a general focal point. So hopefully you see the difference between those, right? That between this one and this one, which really don't have any emphasis, to here where the emphasis is the individual pieces that make up the whole, right? That it's all of it, that they aren't intentionally not picking out, right? Even with this one here, they're not intentionally drawing out an individual, that you have to then look around at all of the individuals rather than kind of zeroing in on one particular point. Okay, the next thing then is with focal point is subordination. And then we'll look at the different types of focal point, or the different elements and principles of art that can be used to create focal point. So subordination is different. It is intentional type of use to create a focal point. What it does is it uses the various tools of focal point and emphasis to intentionally draw the viewer's attention away from a particular aspect of the art. Okay, and why they do this is usually to make a particular point. And this can be done right. So the idea with this is that they're trying. It's like kind of like a trick, right? We get so attuned to looking for focal points that you can use this intentionally to basically subvert the expectation of the art, because focal point, right, creates an expectation of importance. And so if you have a subject, like what we'll see, the best example of this is one that we took a look at, which is landscape, the fall of Icarus. And I'll compare the two again, just so that right, we make sure that that's clear with that. But we looked at that. Okay, so the fall of Icarus. Oops. Landscape, the fall of Icarus, right? And we're going to compare and contrast the fall of Icarus, which are both about the same topic, right? One's the fall of Icarus, the other one's titled Landscape, the fall of Icarus, but they're both about Icarus. And yet in the landscape and the fall of Icarus, the artist uses subordination to draw our eyes everywhere but where Icarus is. And this is done because it creates a different meaning. So the meaning is different from the other fall of Icarus that we're going to look at. Right, essentially the one focal point is Icarus and the act of falling. And in the other, which is the subordination one, the point is every aspect of life happening outside of Icarus falling. And it fundamentally changes the meaning between the two. This is very easy to miss, right? Because focal point draws our attention. And so a lot of times when you look at the landscape, the fall of Icarus, you don't even notice Icarus. Like, everyone will describe everything else that's going on, but they don't even see Icarus because it's so easy to miss. But when you do see it, right, you get that added sense of aha, because you realize there's essentially what happens is you get an initial impression of the artwork. And then if you discover that it's subordination, and a second interpretation, we'll say, or meaning, if you notice the subordination. And sometimes, like, titles and everything else can help you out with that. Let me just write elements of focal point, and then we'll look at the fall of Icarus, the two. Okay, so here's the first one, the fall of Icarus, right? And the focal point is Icarus. And you have the use of primary colors that draw attention. You also have the light sky and the darker colors of the wings and around him. Position, size, all of these things play a key in directing your attention to Icarus and that he's falling. then because of where he's going, then it draws your attention down here. But if you notice, right, everyone is looking up. So even if you somehow start down here, you notice everyone looking up, which forces you to look up. And then Icarus is going to stand out against the lighter sky. And so the whole point of the picture, right, is Icarus. The fall of Icarus, as the title is, right, is about Icarus falling. It's the act of Icarus falling. That's what we're seeing. That's what it's telling, right? In the story of Icarus, it was Greek myth. You have the Icarus was the sun, and his father was the most brilliant inventor. And one of the stories is with Daedalus, that was the father, that Daedalus and Icarus were trapped on the island of Crete by King Minos, and was forced to build and create things for King Minos. He decided eventually they wanted to escape, and so he built himself and his son wings. They were made out of wax and feathers, and he warned his son not to fly too close to the sun, because, I mean, and that you do see, like, stands out in the sky over everything else in the sky besides Icarus, right? Because that's part of the story. But he warns him not to fly too close to the sun because it's made out of wax and it will melt. But Icarus, once he gets going, forgets about his father's warnings, or just chooses not to heed them because he's having fun, and he flies too close to the sun, and the wings fail and he falls to his death, and Daedalus ends up distraught. And so that, right, that myth then is then being portrayed here with specifically the act of Icarus falling, right? And the story was meant to be a warning of not, don't fly too close to the sun. Be careful how far you reach. Pay attention to warnings. Listen to your father. There's a variety of meanings behind that one. But so that this is clear-cut focal point. And the main emphasis is Icarus falling. Then we have landscape, the fall of Icarus, right? I didn't put the first part there, but that's part of the title, landscape, the fall of Icarus. So this uses subordination. So what you see first is it uses emphasis to guide us away from the subject, which is Icarus, or at least the title implies it's Icarus, right? So you have both, because of position and size and color, this guy, this farmer here with his red shirt stands out. He's larger, he's center, he's forward of everyone else, right? We have the depth created because of position. So you have a lot of different elements of focal point going on here all at once because of not only this person, but everything else that's going on. And so you see the farmer first, and then you can kind of follow in the direction to the horse and see that he's tilling. Then you either might go over here and look there, or you go down to this sheep herder here who's looking in that direction, right? And again, remember, when you see people looking, that directional focal point gets we tend to look in whatever the directional focal point of the that's going on in the artwork. So you have this guy first, then you have this guy, and then so this one's giving us this hint to look at him to this way. This guy's giving us a hint to look this way. So then we naturally end up over here, right? Either by bypassing the sheep herder at first, or going from this guy to this guy. But both of them are giving us a direction towards the tree and the mountains. And so then we look over here, and then you notice some ships. Follows that kind of natural line, right? Light sky, so you're not going to pay attention up here much. You're going to look down at the ships with the color. And then, oh no, it cut it off. I put the wrong one. So I'll have to, we saw this in Zoom. I didn't realize that this one cut it off. Icarus is totally right here. And all you see is his legs in the water, right next to this other ship. So there's a ship right here, and it got cut off. I apologize. I should have paid closer attention to where the rest of this image was. I thought I'd picked the one that, the one that showed the whole thing. But Icarus is right there. That's it, right? And all you see is his legs. There's nothing else. So he has already fallen, and he's in the water, And there's also a guy over here fishing, right? But he's looking down. So everything points away from Icarus. And Icarus is super tiny that you don't even notice him. And that, so much so that I cut him off with the formatting. Like I said, we looked at this in the meeting as well. And it's in your book. So please, if you didn't see this one, look in the book to see the whole picture, because it's such a great example of subordination. Or Google it and just type in landscape, the fall of Icarus, and it will pop up. It's definitely worth seeing in whole, and I apologize that I cut it off. But the idea is, right, that you have the fall of Icarus, where Icarus is front and center, and it is the whole point of the picture to be watching that action of him falling. Here, you have almost the same title. Landscape gives it away some, that you've got all this landscape aspect of it. But it's still, the Icarus is still in there, but barely, because everything draws your attention away from Icarus. So how does this change the meaning, right? If the other one's the center of Icarus and about the story of Icarus, this one is that life goes on. Everyone else is too busy to notice that Icarus fell from the sky. No one notices. No one in the artwork has any idea that Icarus is mostly drowned. He's in the water with only his legs left to see. So we don't see the act of falling, but it's more that the idea that there's either people are too busy with their own life to notice an event, which, with the story and the title, it makes it sound like it's this massive event. And this artist is suggesting that it wasn't, right? That the event happened and it wasn't something that caught people's attentions, unlike the other one here, where everyone in town apparently just happened to be hanging out watching Icarus fall, so that it made it this massive event. Versus here, people are on their life looking at other things, working, doing other things, and no one notices. So it makes the whole event of Icarus small and seem unimportant. It also creates a completely different meaning than the first picture. So that's what I like about subordination, is it totally can change the whole meaning behind the same idea, because you're showcasing all this other stuff that, again, most people, when they look at this the first time, they don't even notice Icarus. It takes a while because the focal points are everywhere else, and the emphasis is everywhere else but Icarus. So this is a great example of subordination and how to use it, and also how to cleverly use it to have a different meaning, especially when you compare and contrast the two. Right, where you have one where Icarus is front and center and everyone's looking at him and watching him fall and kind of horrified by it. And then another one where no one even notices, either to suggest, again, that it wasn't that important, or life is busy and life goes on, right? You have this event that seems so massive, but it really wasn't. People were going on with their own lives, and poor Icarus doesn't even get noticed. Okay. So let's go through the different elements of focal point, basically the fundamentals that can be used in focal point. So one of them is directional, and lines will be the next one, which can be directional. It is often directional with lines, but directional is the more subtle one that does not have to be lines. Like, lines are much more in your face. Directional is that it's a variety of things, right? Objects, or like the directional one would be with the farmer to the till to the horse. That there's objects in the artwork that specifically guide your eyes in a particular direction. And so then that usually guides you to the focal point, right? And this can be where people are facing a particular direction. We always tend to then look and see what other people are looking at. This can be objects that kind of point in a direction. Those are kind of the two big ways. Is people facing away, or all objects facing away. or pointing in a direction. So that's directional. So let's look at an example of that. Here we have Judith decapitating Holofernes. I don't say his name right. But this one is directional, right? It's not lines because it's not clear-cut lines. But, right, the focal point is, besides in the title, right, I'm getting decapitated. Where you have the direction, and then the next one showcases that, they draw it in for you, is that you have the arms all pointing in a direction towards his head, right? And his leg too, right? So see how all of this gives you the direction you need to then see the focal point, which is him getting decapitated. The next one is line. So let me go out. I thought I'd just write these real quick and then we'll look at them because they're not very long in the description, and then we can just take a look at the rest. Especially since this wants to not move after I've gone to the PowerPoint. Come on. There we go. Okay, so next is lines. Line is a super, I would say, obvious or you know, easy way. We'll say effective way to follow our attention, to draw our attention. And it makes sense, right? Because lines in itself are often directional. And we take notice of geometric shape. So geometric shapes stand out amongst organic. Especially, and a lot of the times these lines within mixed with organic shape, you're going to have it stand out because it's man-made, and we tend to notice directional line, even if it is all even geometrical shape. And the reason that we tend to notice this is that they, as they appear more visually active, remember, lines often can show movement, and diagonal lines are seen as the more active of them, but you know, horizontal and vertical lines can still be used as well. The diagonal ones, or directional lines, I said directional, should be diagonal. Diagonal lines, sorry, are most visually active, but horizontal and vertical lines can be used as well. We just notice diagonal lines first. And so if you really want it to stand out, that is a way to do it. The next, and it's easy because we generally associate lines with movement. So the next is contrast. With contrast, there's several different aspects of contrast in the styles that can be used. Contrast is a good way to either very obviously, so if you create bold contrast, it stands out immediately. But you can also use contrast in subtle ways as well. So it just depends on what you're wanting to try to showcase. Value is often one, specifically dark versus light. You can also use color and size. These tend to be the three main fundamentals that are used, main methods to showcase contrast. Like I said, some of these are more obvious than others, and contrast is one of those where it can be obvious or subtle in how you do it. And so we're not going to we'll take a look at the end here. The next element that and fundamental that we are looking at is going to be color then. So this is with contrast. So let's break these down. Value is just simply in light and dark, right? You have different values, then you're going to have, it's that code goes back to the positive and negative shapes that we talked about. With color, so let me put, here we'll go over on this side here. With color, what you can do is that it's easy to create a strong emphasis and contrast when you have complementary colors. Right, so complementary colors are going to pop out, I guess, stand out. We'll just say stand out. They also, with color, you can create a strong contrast. And if you want to make it really clear, you have everything in the artwork be all one color except the focal point. Right, and this can be done, likewise you can have it be where nothing is color except the focal point. And that's going to be obvious, where like this is immediately going to draw your attention. If you want it to be more subtle, then you have the colors have less contrast to them, so that they blend in more, and then slowly adjust the value or change in color to create a subtle transition to the focal point, so that it slowly draws our eye to the focal point. If you have everything is one color except for the focal point, your eye is going to immediately go to it, right? If everything's black and white except for the one thing that's color, your eye is going to go immediately to it. But if you have a subtle transition in color and contrast, then you're going to take, essentially it's going to create an emphasis. Here, let's put 5 here for, if you wanted to go subtle, what this does, the purpose, is that it creates an emphasis on the whole artwork first. And then guides you to the focal point. So this is another way to make sure that instead of just skipping to the focal point, which we'll see when we look at the ones that have strong contrast, you do. If you have everything be more subtle, then you force the viewer most of the time to look at the whole of the artwork, and they're going to take in more of what's going on as the whole until they get to the focal point, but it still makes sure to guide you to the focal point at the end, right? So this is not no emphasis or mostly emphasis, right? Where you really don't have a focal point, you just have a lot of elements. This would still have a focal point. It's just that because everything is so similar and it's such a subtle change, you take longer to get there. But you still end up getting to that focal point, right? So want to make sure that's clear. There is a difference between like the ones we looked at for emphasis. Even though at first glance, it might look like those ones where they use subtle change in color, contrast, or value to get to a focal point. You might, if you glanced at it and didn't take a long look, you might think, oh, that's just the whole emphasis. The emphasis is the whole artwork. And that's easy to miss if you aren't paying attention. So the color is nice because it can just create a more subtle aspect to it. The next then is size, and we're going to add shape with that. So with size and shape, by using larger size, usually it's larger. So usually larger size of an object is used to draw attention. And it draws our eyes relatively quick. And it draws us to that object first. We naturally look at things that are larger. Think about the gleaners. When we looked at that, we talked about size and position to create depth, and also the emphasis was on the poorer women picking up the last remaining straw, and that they intentionally were using that for a reversal of the focus on the poor rather than the wealthy that were in the back, right? That's an example of size, and using it with scale, right, to draw your attention to that area first. Shape can also play a role, right? So if you have various shapes or a single type of shape. So if you have a single type of shape and a lot of them, right, several of that same, and then one different shape, we're going to notice that which is not the same, right? So the different shape will stand out. And oftentimes shape and size are used together. Okay, so you'll have something be larger and it will be a different shape from the rest of the group. On 1D here. Yeah. Okay, the next one then is position. And this we talked about with depth as well. Right, position is used to create depth. You say position placement. Right, as usually things in front are closer. And the reality is that we pay attention to what is closer. Again, the Gleaners works with both the size and position, the scale and position, right? We talked about those were those elements that went together, and you absolutely use them together. Closer objects are larger. Further away objects are smaller. So it naturally creates depth, but that size and position is important. So we pay attention to what is closer. The other thing of position is when you place something in a central position, most of the time, central position creates a focal point. It is also something that we look at first. So you don't have to have it on there. Position alone of something that's in the front and larger is going to draw your attention. If something's in the front and center and larger, it's even more likely to draw your attention. And that will always kind of be the focal point, the main focal point. And then lastly, the unusual. So what happens is one way to grab a viewer's attention is if you showcase the unusual. The unusual will draw the viewer's attention because we notice things that are out of place. And not just, so one, we notice things that are out of place. We also notice things that, right, don't look right. When things don't look right, even if you're looking around, it immediately kind of draws you back to or snaps you to that position. Oftentimes you will pass it at first, and then your brain catches up. Basically sends a message that something is off. And then you go back. If it's really large and central and unusual, then it's probably going to be the first thing you see. But we'll see both examples. We'll see an example of where it's front and center and it's unusual and you immediately see it. And then you see another one which uses emphasis to kind of look like everything's kind of, they're unique but the same. And then you kind of pass it and then you go back and be, whoa, wait. Okay, yeah, that's completely different. And then once you notice it, it completely creates the focal point for it. But the unusual draws our eye. So let's take a look at these. Here you have, the next one we had was lines. So with the first one, right, was directional. The arms weren't lines, but it drew us down to it. Here you have, with the canals in the garden, right, the line. And so you end up getting the kind of cross section here as the central point. It guides you down to where you look and you'll see where it's pouring in here. But the main focal point is where the two lines cross. Right, and so line is good for not only directions, a directional to get you to draw you to where they want you to go, but creates a really solid focal point. Then we have contrast, right? This one is the value, right? Light and dark. So here we have the Pope there as the bishop, the Pope, I think for this one, this is the central point. He's light with all the white. Everything else you have is dark around here. Even the people, which also, again, a lot of focal point is multiple clues, not just one. Here you have directional as well, because they're all looking mostly towards him. Then you also have position, because he's center. The big focal point though is the contrast. Very light to dark. Here's color, right? This should stand out. This is what I meant with, like, if everything's the same color, one, you have this general overall emphasis of guiding you to the center one. But because it's such a stark contrast in color, the red apple stands out immediately and you're immediately drawn to it, especially because they use emphasis, similarity in emphasis, right? That you just tend to ignore that, right? That equals that you just kind of look past it. It's the same thing with the water or the abstract art. Because it's so same, you tend to just kind of, it all kind of just blends together. It's the same thing with the apples. Because all the green apples are there, we kind of just immediately push them out and focus on the one that's different. Here's one where you have no color, or black and white, and one thing is color. And that's always, this is even, you could argue, a more stark contrast in value, and therefore it stands out even more, right? It takes over. Where the apples, you still see them, and once you've focused in on the red apple, then if you start to look around, right, they're bright enough that they're still giving some emphasis. But when this definitely overpowers everything else, that it kind of fades into the background. Size and shape, right? So difference in shapes. You have these shapes here, which is a large part of it. And then you have the circle here, and you have smaller circles there, which also gives you a direction to look in. It's different. Which, I mean, you could argue is pointing towards this. But this is because this is so much larger and different shape, we're drawn to that centerpiece. Here's one that's just constructed with, on the computer here. But the same idea of, these have several different, you have, I guess, 3 different shapes. These ones, this one, and then the center one. Here, it's the idea that everything is the same shape, and then the one larger shape that's different, or the one shape that's different is larger and a different color. You do have some squares that are a different color, and so those stand out and create more emphasis than the square, the gray squares. But ultimately, no matter where you put the circle in this composition, it's going to stand out because it's larger and it's the one different shape. And then here's position, right? It's larger and it's in the front. So this head, compared to these other heads, becomes the focal point. They're also looking at this head, which gives us direction as well. But because it's in front and it's larger, even though it's not center in this case, you pay attention to that. And if you're tempted to go look at the other heads, right, they're all looking at that one in the front that then draws your focal point back. And then lastly, unusual, right? This weird looking leathery thumb skin as a statue, it stands out. This one's the obvious one, right? Right away you see it and you go, oh, what's going on with that? That unusual is meant to have that what kind of feeling. Now here's the unusual one that it doesn't always stand out at first, because you've got all these people in a line, and it should seem like that other one where there's no clear emphasis at first. And even to the point where you're just like, okay, going past, but then you go back because your brain registers, wait, something's off, right? And then it clearly becomes the focal point once you notice it. But this one is easier when you glance at it to just notice a bunch of people that aren't really, there's nothing super that makes them stand out. And this was done intentionally, right? This emphasis was intentional, that there's no clear-cut emphasis. If you don't look at the guy's head for a second, there's no clear-cut emphasis. It's one of those where the whole, right? There's individual pieces, but the emphasis is the whole of the artwork, until your brain registers that his face is that of a fly. And that's unusual, and it draws, so you might go past it this way or this way, and then you get drawn back to it once your brain registers the unusual. And then, like I said, and then it's a clear-cut focal point. Okay, so that's it for focal point. We're looking at pattern and rhythm, which is our last one for the fundamentals. And then the following week, the next week, we're going to be moving into the history and art. So starting with prehistoric hunting and gathering societies, and the artwork that the small amount of artwork that we have for kind of prehistory onward.